Let's go back to 1066, when William of Normandy, the Conqueror, had invaded England and defeated Harold. His power was absolute. The victorious William, as the king, laid claim to every square inch of English soil and parcelled out the tenancies to his barons as reward for their support in the invasion and their continued support in the future. This was the feudal system, and there would be almost 1,000 years of bitter strife and hard-won concessions before every adult had the right to vote for a representative in a parliament. Along the way, King John was forced to sign Magna Carta in 1215. In the centuries that followed, powerful nobles and the church conspired in common cause factions against successive kings. And Henry VI introduced the 40-shilling franchise for electors. They gained concessions when they succeeded, or lost their heads when it went wrong. By 1689, England had seen civil war, a king lose his head, a commonwealth under the rule of Oliver Cromwell, the restoration of the monarchy, and finally King James deposed in favour of William and Mary, who would be England's first constitutional monarchs under the Bill of Rights. This bill set out the limits of the reigning monarch's powers and also the rights of a parliament in government. In the century that followed, during the reign of George III, England would lose the American colonies in the American War of Independence. 10 years later, the King and Parliament would see the French Revolution escalate from demands for reform into the proclamation of a republic and the wholesale massacre of the King, his family, and any of the aristocracy that didn't flee the country. The first 32 years of the 18th century saw 3 kings on the throne of England. As far as women were concerned, these years saw the publication of A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792. There were politically active women reformers campaigning alongside men for social and political reform, for example Elizabeth Fry, the Manchester Female Reform Society, and the Female Republicans of Manchester Society. A growing number of writers and speakers were demanding social changes and women's rights in general. Many were supporters of Robert Owen's radical socialist beliefs and practices from the early 1800s. Successive monarchs and their governments were noticeably nervous, reluctant to introduce any reform that might empower men other than those of the wealthier or landed classes. These were the years of mechanical invention, industrial and commercial expansion, and the rise of a wealthy class of industrialists. The majority of workers lived and worked in the new enormous centres of industry and didn't have representation in Parliament. They wanted change. There were also the years of industrial riots against the new machines, of political unrest, and bloodshed, such as that seen in Manchester at Peterloo in 1819 and in the Bristol Reform riots in 1831. Changes finally came with the Reform Act of 1832, but there was nothing for women. 1832 was the year in which the first Reform Bill was passed, despite the determined efforts by the House of Lords and King William to prevent it. The 1832 Reform Act hadn't gone far enough, and there was still great unrest with increasing demands for change being made, along with a growing number of social reform groups for both men and women. One of these was the Chartist movement, which grew from 1838, despite the panic-stricken government and Queen Victoria still being terrified by the spectre of a French Revolution reenacted in England. It reached its peak in 1848, but support fell away as Chartist leaders and supporters were brutally imprisoned or transported as criminals. In the years that followed, a few individuals began to call for increased rights for women, and middle-class women began to come together in small, informal groups to debate the current issues in education, politics and social conditions. It wasn't always just about the vote. Their concerns ranged over a wide number of gender reform issues. One such group met at Langham Place in London throughout the 1850s and 60s, led by Barbara Lee Smith Boddicker and Bessie Rayner Parkes. They published the periodical The Woman's Journal. Many of them also joined the Kensington Group, formed in 1865 to debate reform and in particular women's suffrage. By 1865 it was clear that another reform bill was on the horizon, and the Kensington Group began their campaign. They couldn't have dreamed that it would be over 50 years before they would achieve even a limited franchise. In 1865, the newly elected MP, John Stuart Mill, had included women's suffrage in his election campaign, and in 1867, at Barbara Boddicker's request, and with almost 1,500 signatures on a petition, he introduced a women's suffrage amendment into debate on the new reform bill. The first of many, it was rejected unceremoniously. 1867 saw another Reform Act, and the franchise for men extended further. But there was, again, nothing for women. However, it had kick-started the women's suffrage movement. Societies were started in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, Birmingham and Bristol. The Manchester Society was founded by the radical feminist Elizabeth Wolstenholme, later Wolstenholme-Elmy on her marriage. It became the dominant group and was the most radical. It was this group that was responsible for bringing together local suffrage groups into the loose Federation of National Society for Women's Suffrage, the NSWS, which would coordinate action by the different groups. Early members of the Manchester group were Jacob and Ursula Bright, Richard Pankhurst and Lydia Becker. Some of these early suffragists would spend the next 60 years campaigning for women's suffrage on the same terms as men.